Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome on into yet another Rooted Podcast. Tim Straubel coming to you from our Rooted Podcast production facility out here in beautiful Denver, Colorado. Thanks for being with us, be it on iTunes, SoundCloud, or the host website, of course, stayrooted.com. Hey, quick reminder to subscribe and review the podcast if you're listening to it, which is the only way you can hear this, so I'm assuming you're listening. Go ahead, subscribe, review. It helps us kind of grow the podcast and get it out to more people. Also, hit up our YouTube channel and check out our TV platform, Rooted TV. It's been evolving really quickly these last couple of months. We just got our August metrics back. We've doubled our Q3 views and distribution as opposed to Q2, so we're super excited about that. We love making these episodes. It's a ton of fun. Really cool stuff coming up as well, including a possible spin-off podcast we'll be announcing shortly. So follow our social as well for those announcements. As for this show today, extremely pumped for the show because one of the hottest topics surrounding the cannabis industry lately is the stock market. As cannabis companies make their way to various public listings, there's an ongoing debate centered on valuation, volatility, strategy, more stuff just like that in terms of cannabis and trading cannabis stocks. So in order to get to the bottom of what's going on and what it means to you, okay, I went out and got Alan Brochstein, who is widely considered one of the foremost, if not the biggest, cannabis expert to discuss what is going on right now, what you should be looking for, and what you should be careful of when it comes to playing the cannabis stock market. We're going to bring in Alan in just a second to break all of this down for us, but before we do, I have to shout out our awesome sponsors, Green Bros, home of the world's premier dry harvesting solutions. You got to check out their Alchemist machines, which take the wonderful trim created by your Green Bros dry trimmer and turn it into gold. All you do is simply insert your trim into the machine. It tumbles the crystals right off the leaves, leaving you with a beautiful product and further profit. Stop selling your trim for minimum value or even throwing it away like I've seen at some cultivations, and get yourself a Green Bros dry trimmer and Alchemist so you can maximize your profits today. Hit them up, greenbros.com, or call 844-DRY-TRIM to schedule a free demo in your area. That's 844-DRY-TRIM. I tell you, Alan, as I bring you in, that's one company I wish would go public because I'd love to get some stock in what they're doing and the machines they're creating for harvest. I've had their CEO, Colin Reichert, on a couple of times, and they're doing some really cool things. And I think going public might be in the future in a couple of years for them. But for now, we have so much to talk about. Let's get into it. Alan, welcome on into the show. You're the founding partner at new Cannabis Ventures, in addition to being a founder, analyst, and portfolio manager at 420 Investor. Both of the links to those websites are in the description of the podcast below, so you can go ahead and check those out. Alan, thanks for doing the show again, man. It's been a couple of years.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. It's been a great 4 or 5 years that I've known you, Tim.
Well, thanks, man. Anytime we can get you back on the show, and honestly, with the way that the cannabis stocks are just blowing up, I'd love to get you back on more frequently to talk more about this. So we're going to work on that. Maybe even once we're done with the show, I'll talk to you. But give me a little bit about not you give me a little bit about your background. I want to give the people some about your background because I have a good bio on you, and I'm going to ask you to fill in some of the blanks. But sure. You started your career back on Wall Street in 1986. You've been around the stock game forever. I mean, back in 2013, you shift your focus to the cannabis world, and really ever since then, you've been one of, if not the go-to voice on the subject, with hundreds, if not thousands of articles published in the arena. You're also a regular speaker at events and conferences, in addition to being a frequent media source for media outlets like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Fox Business, Bloomberg TV. To sum it up, okay, if you don't know anything about Alan, he's the guy you should be listening to in this subject matter. So I have to ask, Alan, first, I mentioned Wall Street back in 1986. Man, I imagine the Wolf of Wall Street when I think of those times, but I'm assuming your experience was a little bit different, yeah?
It was. I actually started out in the bond world, which is kind of boring, but it was, for a young person, it was exciting. I was trading collateralized mortgage obligations right when they started in asset-backed securities. And so it's pretty exciting as a young person right out of college doing that, but it took me a while, but I got into equities about 12 years later.
Well, what was the ambiance like? What was the culture like of that area of Wall Street back in the late 80s, early 90s?
You know, I didn't like it that much. I loved living in New York and doing the work, but I did not like the culture at all. Very short-term focused, all about making as much money as you can, and a lot of men, mainly white, it wasn't my kind of thing, to be perfectly frank. I was glad to get away from the sell side, the investment bank, broker dealer, and get more to what they call the buy side, which is managing people's money. But even that, I love what I'm doing now. This is the best job I've ever had.
And you're in the cannabis space now. You enter the arena of the cannabis space back in 2013, which in the cannabis industry, anyone who's been doing it since 2013 seems like a grandfather to the industry almost, because you're one of the OGs.
OG.
Yeah, right. What was the scene like when you first started covering cannabis stocks? And I guess, could you relate it to any other industry or time outside of the cannabis industry that you've experienced?
Yeah, not for me personally, but it was the Wild West, and I can relate it to certain fads or themes like 3D printing, maybe that had preceded that. A lot of interest in 3D printing, but this was bigger than anything I had ever seen, except maybe the internet. Obviously, was big, but very real, and I was really attracted to it because it was a Wild West, and everybody was excited. But nobody really knew how to analyze the companies that were out there, and they weren't very good. And so my initial mission was really about protecting people from losing money. And it's been great to see my mission kind of change over the last few years as we've had higher quality companies enter the space, and we can talk about that, to helping people to make money, which is a lot more fun than helping them to lose money or explaining why they just lost money.
Now, Alan, we sat down for a Rooted podcast interview back in 2016. That's worth noting in case one of a handful of people want to go back and find that show. But mainly because your information is invaluable for me, because you started, like you said, trying to help people not lose money. And then as this has progressed, you've turned into the voice that people go to be like, okay, now I need to interpret what Alan's saying and possibly make money. Since our interview back in early 2016, how have you seen the market change? Has anything surprised you?
Yeah, it's been a very big change. And actually, right after we did our interview, I spoke to the CFA Society in Houston. Well, that was about a year later, in 17 actually. But I wasn't comfortable when we did that interview really telling people to get on board yet. So just to kind of go back to 2016, the companies still weren't that great. The Canadian space was really about the only thing, except for GW Pharma, that investors that were looking for quality could even touch. And so the end of the year had what I would call a typical catalyst-driven rally. We had, if you recall, at the end of 2016, the elections, and there were 8 states with ballot initiatives, 5 for legalization, 3 for medical, and that brought a lot of traders back into the market. I think my index tripled or something like that, and it was like, I called that one like clockwork. It started on September 1st, like I predicted, and it ended right around the elections, like I suggested. And remember, the elections kind of threw us for a loop because the control of Congress shifted, and the president, there was a lot of uncertainty about what would happen with the cannabis space. But even though there were these headwinds coming out of 2016 and into 2017, by that year, mid-year, I was comfortable talking to the CFA Society of Houston because of what I was seeing, and that was more quality companies entering the space, institutional type of companies, and some of them focused on the United States as well. So it's only been a year and a half. Right after I spoke to the CFA Society in April 2017, I say right after, it was October, 6 months later, we had what was really a game changer for the industry. And a lot of your listeners may not remember this. Even though it's been less than a year, Canopy Growth received an investment from Constellation Brands, and that was the first major cross-border, cross-industry investment. And there's going to be a lot more of that type of thing. Constellation Brands, if your listeners aren't familiar, is a global alcohol company. So, that's one of the industries, but there's several others: tobacco, pharmaceuticals, and then consumer packaged goods companies. And we're starting to see more of this now. So that ignited a rally a little bit ahead of what I expected was going to be a good end of 2017 because of California legalizing. We've moved past these catalyst-driven rallies to truly a market now. I'm not going to say the valuations are necessarily right every single minute, but the quality is going up. Investors can invest in multiple themes. We're talking about CBD or cannabis in the United States, cannabis in Europe, cannabis in obviously in Canada and around Australia, Africa. There's a lot of different things going on around the world, Tim.
And something you mentioned I thought was interesting was all the pairings. And I'm interested in when word of this stuff comes out. For instance, in the last week or so, there was a rumor that Aurora Cannabis could be pairing up with Coca-Cola to maybe make some sort of CBD beverage. But then no one's confirmed anything, so it seems like just a rumor. Does the stock fluctuate based on these rumors, or does it have to be kind of set in stone or a press release in order for these stocks to fluctuate?
Oh, no. So even on the highest quality companies, like you just mentioned, these rumors can move the stock, no doubt. Now, Aurora's moving on other things as well. They've announced, they haven't put out in a press release, but they've said it to the press that they are uplisting to the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ next month. So, you have to be careful to think that the move's related just to Coke, but it definitely moved that stock. It moved other stocks. When Diageo announced they were looking in talks with 3 Canadian LPs, it moved a bunch of stocks as well. Molson did a deal with what's called Hexo now. It moved that stock a little bit. So definitely the rumors. Now, you go down the quality chain, it can move the stocks a lot. I don't even want to mention the names of these companies, but there's some companies out there that are, kind of, and one of them's NASDAQ, for instance, but they'll say something like, we're testing CBD, and the stock doubles or triples. So I think people are really hungry for these stories. And the other big thing that's happened, the access to capital has gotten so much better. And people in the United States, I think, are catching on that you can make money in these stocks. And historically, it's been hard for U.S. investors because they either had to buy on the OTC. And if you listen to somebody like me, pre all this stuff, I would say never buy a stock on the OTC. And a lot of institutions can't buy over-the-counter stocks. They have to buy New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ. So we saw Kronos Group earlier this year, followed by Canopy Growth, and more recently Tilray. I'm sorry, I had that backwards. Tilray, then Canopy. I don't remember the order, but all 3 of those are on major exchanges now, and that's really kind of opened people's eyes up. We did see it's such a contrast to him a year ago in November. 2 years ago in November. Innovative Industrial Properties, which is a REIT on the New York Stock Exchange. All they do is invest in cannabis cultivation and I guess also in retail facilities or dispensaries. That was a dud. We saw some big TSX IPOs. They were duds. But now all of a sudden, when companies go public, it's the shiny new toy syndrome to some degree. This week, we saw Aurora spun off a company. The company had assets of $21 million. That's all. And it opened up with a market cap of $1.5 billion. The company just got started. It's crazy, like the internet times. Now, not to say that company won't do well, but to go from 20 cents to $10 instantly was kind of crazy. But we're starting to see higher quality companies go public, and the United States investors are finally catching on that you can either buy direct in Canada, perhaps, or buy an OTC ticker of a Canadian listed company. So I think that's helping things.
Alan, any other industry where you would potentially see a stock go 20 cents to $10 in such a short span, or is the cannabis industry it right now?
Yeah, that's it right now. I mean, we've seen obviously a lot of speculation in Bitcoin. And, when you ask me about other things, I focus 99% of my time that I'm awake on the cannabis industry. So I honestly don't pay that much attention to things. So there may be some other things going on. But when I think back over my career, this, in some ways, what I just talked about is like the internet bubble. And what happens is it's just a flood of demand that exceeds the supply. And the demand isn't very well informed. And they just buy. And I'm sure you're familiar with the idea that, people like to buy things when they're going up and because they're going to go up more. And that doesn't always work out. And as much as I said I'm trying to help people make money instead of losing money, I would definitely say you can lose a lot of money. And, Tilray has been a huge story. Like I've never personally watched so closely. I know there's been other stories like that. But for your listeners, Tilray, a good company, I mentioned earlier, they went public on the NASDAQ. They don't even have a Canadian listing. And they had a lot of revenue. They were kind of underfollowed because they weren't yet public company. But a good company that checked every box I could think of. And they came out with very few shares relative to the actual number of shares in the company that could trade, about 11 million out of about 100 million. And so at the peak, that they sold shares at 17. It opened up at like 20. It went up. It came back to 22. But at the peak on Wednesday, it peaked at $300. I mean, it's crazy. I don't know who in their right mind would buy it above $50 actually. So it's on its way back down, I guess. But that reminds me of the internet bubble. Just a company would come out and all of a sudden the stock would go parabolic. But there's a lot of other examples. That's not my game, Tim.
And that's a perfect example, Tilray. I was going to ask you about that. Thanks for covering it with me, not even having to ask. You mentioned something probably 5 minutes ago or so about 2016, the political landscape shifting. We talked about a second ago that when news of possible partnerships, Coca-Cola and Aurora Cannabis, for example, could cause the stock to go up. In terms of the political landscape, when someone like Jeff Sessions comes out and says something negative about cannabis, or Trump comes out and says, oh, I would support states' rights, how does that shift the needle?
Yeah. So this is very important. And if I got one thing right this year, I've gotten a lot of things right, but the one thing that really stands out, and I was a leader and people were not happy. At 420 Investor, I remember the minute that news hit about Jeff Sessions, and let me just say in case people don't know or don't remember, I want to just back up. But before I back up, I just want to say the minute that news came out, I sold every single stock in my trading portfolio. This is a paper portfolio, not real money. And I raised as much cash as I could in every other model portfolio, which I generally don't have cash. Those are fully invested, but I'm allowed to go to cash. I said, this is an emergency. I hate to be the panic monger, but you need to protect yourself. And sure enough, the market crashed. This was right after the California fueled rally. And so this was a time where I really stepped up and I was able to buy back at much lower prices. And so just to explain what happened and to kind of warn people, we're not out of the woods, but what happened was the whole cannabis industry was built on something called the Cole Memo. I'm sure you've talked about that with others before. The Cole Memo was only an executive order kind of thing. It was, I forget exactly what they call it, but it wasn't a law. But the whole cannabis industry moved forward in 2013 and into 2014 when Colorado legalized on the basis of this memorandum that said, if you do these 8 things, we won't mess with you from the federal government. And so all of a sudden, there were no rules. Jeff Sessions rips the thing up. And I was like, oh my God, this is, we always thought it could happen, but we didn't know. When it happened, you had to be careful. Now, let's move forward. That was in January, and it just caused a huge plunge. In April, stocks much lower. We get this surprise that Cory Gardner, Republican senator from Colorado, your senator right now, and President Trump had come to this political bargain that basically Trump was going to support states' rights. So basically, investors knew that it wasn't a done deal, but they saw that all this fear about shutting down on the cannabis industry was probably not going to happen. And so here we are 5 months later, almost 6 months later. There's been legislation introduced, but the chances of it passing, according to experts, is like 2%. So what I've been guiding my subscribers at 420 Investor to is to just understand we don't have to have legalization. We don't even have to make things better. We just have to be assured they're not getting worse. And then these companies can develop. Now, it'd be great if they could do some things like, and this is marginal for near-term economics of the industry, great for the long term, for patients, for everybody. Last week, exactly a week ago, I guess it was Thursday, not Friday, the House Judiciary Committee passed this legislation, or they moved it to the Congress basically to vote on. It's not scheduled. It's Medical Cannabis Research Act. It's sponsored by Matt Gaetz, a Republican in Florida. And this is historic. Now, whether or not it passes, I listened to that and was blown away because you have Republicans and Democrats that are agreeing that we need to do this. Now, I don't know if it'll ultimately happen. That committee had 20 people on it. Everybody, all they were disagreeing about was whether or not people with misdemeanors should be allowed or not allowed to participate in the industry. And there was a little bit of an issue about that. But the bigger picture is we have a Congress that's starting to recognize, hey, this industry is getting big. And instead of standing in the way, we need to do things to make it grow responsibly. And allowing U.S. institutions to do research would be a great thing for everybody. It's not going to make anybody rich tomorrow. It's going to build the industry over time. Similarly, there's a lot of other things that need to be addressed, like 280E taxation, for instance, that onerous tax that's imposed on cannabis producers and retailers. That would be nice. Improving the banking situation. How many people have to get killed because of all this cash in the system? When are they going to clarify things so that credit cards are accepted, like in every other industry? So things like this would be great, but I think the environment has changed radically. Now, I'll throw something a little bit more nuanced in there. It appears that the Canadian companies are getting more confident about things changing in the United States, and they are setting up operations. I mentioned Aurora creating the spinoff earlier called Australis Capital. That's what it's about. Canopy Growth got that second investment, which was much larger, from Constellation. By the way, I say they got it. It's not a done deal yet. It's still in review from the Bureau of Competition or something like that in Canada. But they've done a deal to get 5 billion Canadian, and that is earmarked for the United States eventually. And if you listen to Bruce Linton, the CEO, he says, we're just waiting for clarification from the federal government that it's okay. And so it's pretty complicated, but essentially the Canadian securities exchanges have clamped down, and they say if you want to be on the Toronto Stock Exchange, you can't have any business operations in the United States. So people have been divesting and doing things, but now everybody's figuring out, I need to have call options. I'm going to divest, but I want to be able to pull this stuff back quickly, or I'm going to do this spinoff. So the future of the cannabis industry, it's not in Canada. And these guys have a head start, and they're going to do great in pursuing other jurisdictions. But the future of the cannabis industry is probably right here in the United States. It's a huge market. We have a great product set, unlike Canada, which doesn't have extracts right now, or not good ones anyway. So a lot of improvement ahead in the United States from a market that's already functioning very well, Tim.
Before we get any further, Alan, I want to mention you have an awesome newsletter. So people are listening to the show and they're like, oh, well, how do I keep up on this information? Where do I go? Obviously, you can go to newcannabisventures.com, 420investor.com. But if you don't even want to worry about that, how do people go about getting the newsletter, Alan?
So, the good thing is I offer the paid subscription, and people love it. And I don't want to talk anybody out of it, but it's a commitment. It's $600 a year, and people tell me it's worth it. So that's 420 Investor, and that's really for people that really want specific advice. But for people who want news, New Cannabis Ventures, it's free, and we cover what we try to do is serve as a filter. There's a lot of news and information out there, but a lot of silly companies putting out stuff. So we try to save our readers time by focusing on the leading investors and the leading companies in the space. So we do publish a weekly newsletter. We try to put a thoughtful introduction into that before we just share kind of what we thought was the most important news of the week. If you go to newcannabisventures.com, you can find a link to sign up for that newsletter. It's like, 36,000, 37,000 people getting that newsletter every week.
Now, you say you spend 99% of your time in the cannabis world, thinking about cannabis stocks, reading cannabis stories. Are you yourself an investor in the market, or do you just cover it?
Yeah, you've probably asked me that before, and my answer's the same. I'd say, and I'll give you a short answer and then a little bit longer answer because I think it's important. The short answer is I have never bought a cannabis stock, and the reason for that is I'm offering model portfolios to my subscribers at 420 Investor, and I don't want to be in a position to front run them or to have my own personal stock trading to interfere at all with what I'm doing. So I stayed true to that. Now, could I legally or technically change? I guess I could. And the truth is, I may invest in private companies at some point. I haven't yet. So that's something, and I'll disclose that. I have a public disclosure statement. But the bigger picture, I used to really love that I could say I am 100% objective. Everything that I make from my work with the cannabis industry is from my subscribers, but that's no longer true. I like to make sure that everybody knows that it's all disclosed. But we are working with a select group of publicly traded and private cannabis companies at New Cannabis Ventures, which we launched 3 years ago. We started working with public companies 2 years ago. So this is all disclosed. It does leave me obviously technically biased. I did survey my subscribers at 420 Investor at the end of the year, early January, to ask them their impression. Does this actually leave me acting like I'm biased. And they said unequivocally no. It's like maybe 1% said yes, which is, if you do a survey and you only get 1%, that's pretty awesome. So that's kind of my position, Tim. I'm not on any boards. I'm asked to be on board of directors, board of advisors all the time. I just try to steer clear of as many conflicts as I can.
You have to invest somewhere, though, right? I mean, you've been around it so long. So what are you investing in? What
Oh, God.
areas?
I told you that 99% of my time is focused on cannabis. That's probably not true. It's probably like 97%. So I had a neglected IRA. My wife has a 401k. She left her job and she's put in a rollover, and I'll help her. But for her, it's just mutual funds. For me, I totally neglected it, and it's kind of sad what I do. I'm up like 30% this year without that much trading. So it's been kind of a fun experiment, but it's mainly I have these stocks that I used to cover 5 years ago, and I don't have any new stocks. It's all these old stocks. There's not that many. I watch the charts every now and then, and when they go down, I buy them. When they go up, I sell them. It's kind of silly, but I really don't invest much. I'm investing my time in the cannabis industry.
Well, let's get to some nitty gritty here and talk about a couple actual companies. We mentioned Aurora Cannabis. They're a company people seem to be buying stock in. I guess to preface this, you mentioned Tilray, and that is a company that, like you said, started at $17 or $20 a share, got up to almost 300, earlier this week. Now they're back in the mid hundreds, somewhere like that, trading for a lot of money. Then you look at a company like Aurora Cannabis, who was $6-7 a share, maybe now towards like 10. I guess what's the big reason why there's such a disparity in price? And do you think Aurora is one of those companies that could have staying power long term?
So let me say, like I said earlier, I disclose, and it's on my website. So Aurora's been a client of ours since day one. They were the first public company, along with Canopy Growth, that we decided to work with. And so everybody should understand that. With that said, I have never been a huge believer in the Aurora stock. It's kind of sad because it's done so well. There's been some others that have done well too. But to answer your question, there's close to 1 billion shares of Aurora. So that's part of it. There's 100 million of Tilray and 1 billion of Aurora. So I don't want to get into which one's worth more. I mean, I would tell you right now, though, I said earlier, Tilray is worth a lot less. So I don't want to say what I think Aurora's worth. It's not that important. But it is a great company. And I think if people are trying to, I get this question a lot from my own subscribers, I tell them what I think. But from outsiders, I don't have time to just tell people for free what I think. We get a lot of emails. I just say, join 420 Investor. But since you're interviewing me, I will say, Aurora has done a bunch of deals. And there's several risks that people are aware of as well. One, that maybe they overpaid or aren't going to properly integrate one of these deals. I'm okay with that one. I don't think that's really, it's fair to wonder, but I don't think that's the big risk. The second one is they have really bet the ranch on a new style of cultivation, and there's some scaling up risk. Again, I'm not able to predict it, but I like people to understand, what others are thinking, what they should be thinking about, which is, what if it doesn't live up to their expectations? This is proven technology that's never been applied to the cannabis space. So, and they have a lot of these facilities going up around the world, actually. So I think that's something. And then everybody should also understand it's not a risk, but a explanation. They've done these acquisitions for stock, and then the people that get Aurora stock sell it. So at times that's been a depressant on the stock. So, but it's definitely one of the leading Canadian LPs. You don't have to have me say that. That's widely known.
Again, 420investor.com. If you want more and just more incredible inside information or how Alan's mind is working, you got to hit up 420investor.com. Now, we've talked about Tilray, Aurora, Canopy, a couple of those companies. You mentioned DW Pharma at the top of this. Are there any big companies or storylines that are out there that you think people should just be aware of? I'm not saying to buy or sell, but could you share a couple that we should have our eyes on?
Yes, I will. So, I think in the United States, you're starting to see, as I mentioned, some companies that can raise capital. Now, I'm not saying to buy the stock today, and they are a client as well. Ianthus, they were the first Canadian company with U.S. operations to go public on the CSE. They may not have been the first, but they were the first credible one. I'd rather say it that way. And it's a fantastic story, but without getting into the details, why people should pay attention to it. One of the things I learned about who was going to succeed in Canada was who could raise money. And so I used to joke, and I still say it, the Canadian cannabis companies are better at growing their bank accounts than at growing cannabis. And it's the truth. It won't always be true, but it's true now. And the companies that are the leaders today there are the ones that have been able to raise money and deploy it. So I think investors should be paying attention to the companies that are in the United States. Now, I'm going to tell you Ianthus because they were the first, and also two other things. One, this company Gotham Green. It's well, I think the principals have all moved out to LA, but it was a New York-based cannabis-focused private equity fund. Put $50 million into the company. They got a great deal, but it's a very strategic investment. That was earlier this year. Second, the company just raised $30 million. It hasn't closed yet in what's called a bought deal. There's a lot of money for a U.S. operating company to raise this way. So they've proven they can raise capital. Your readers are welcome to, listeners, I'm sorry, are welcome to look into the story more, but they're not the only ones. There's others. We work with some of them like MPX, which has a ton of revenue in Arizona. They operate in Canada, in Massachusetts is coming on, Nevada as well. That's another one, MPX. There's some Canna Royalty, not a client. That's a company I've been following for a while, and I got on the bandwagon there last December because they shifted. Instead of being an outside investor in a bunch of companies, they became an operating company and they focused on California. I think it was a brilliant bet. So that's been one of my favorite ones to watch, or I've had it in my model portfolios and still do. MedMen, I don't like the valuation, but you got to give them credit for what they've achieved. So it's one to watch as well. Again, a U.S. company, multi-state, went to Canada. I would say also in that same vein, there's a company, GTI or Green Thumb Industries out of Chicago. Same thing. And both of these companies have raised capital. So these are all companies to watch. I would caution that there are more of these companies to come. Now, I have not said this company publicly anywhere, and they're not really truly public yet. It's called Green Growth Brands. They are going to be a client of New Cannabis Ventures, to preface it, but this is what really excites me about where we're headed. So you've heard of DSW before, an American Eagle, right? So
yeah, absolutely. I just realized my listeners can't hear me nod. So
yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
So everybody knows DSW. The Schottenstein family is like royalty in Columbus, Ohio, retailing brilliance. They're going big time into the cannabis industry through this Green Growth Brands. The initial huge asset is a Nevada operation, but they're going to be multi-state, retail focused. If you look at what's going on in the industry right now, there's money being raised. There's not a lot of retail expertise. I don't want to denigrate everybody else, but nobody like the Schottenstein family is in the cannabis space, and this is going to be their platform. So I'm really excited about. I think that's one to watch too. I don't even know what the valuation is going to be. There was a kind of a complicated deal done, a three-way merger with a public company already, and so it's called Xanthic. The symbol in Canada is XTHC. It's halted right now, so it's going to start trading in the fourth quarter. There is a OTC listing as well, but it's pretty complicated, and I hate to say anything's a good buy when you don't know what the price is. So I don't know, but it's one to watch because this is like a global retailer coming into the cannabis space, and it's not going to be just them, Tim. There's going to be more and more of this, so it's very exciting to me.
Now, we talked about some to watch and some bright spots you mentioned coming up. What scares you about the way the cannabis stock marketplace is evolving? I mean, I've heard a lot of outside cannabis industry media companies really urging people to pump the brakes on cannabis stocks. There's an obvious bubble on the horizon. But what worries you about this?
Yeah, some of the speculative behavior worries me. I worry if the whole market gets like that. I don't see it that way right now. I have an index. It's up 100%, a little bit over 100% from last October, when the day before Canopy and Constellation announced their initial deal. And that was from a pretty depressed level. That was from the lows of the year, believe it or not. So I view, I think in early stages like this, things like valuation are kind of weird. I'm the kind of person that used to laugh at the valuation of Amazon, and I'd check it a year later and I'd laugh at it and it was higher. A year later, it was higher. And so it's not my style of investing. So I'm a little bit personally challenged by some of the valuations to begin with. But when I look at what these valuations are, I told you, I think that I thought MedMen and GTI seem too high and there's going to be more. But in general, I can find things that are much cheaper that seem like they're decent deals. And I actually am able to find some stocks that are interesting. So you have to be careful about warning people too much. I just said that to my subscribers today. I don't want to be the boy who cried wolf. I'm always telling people, be careful, be careful. So I don't want to tell people, oh, jump in, it's warm, don't worry about anything. There's always things to worry about. There's still a bunch of scammers out there trying to exploit the industry, whether it's through private companies or public companies. The SEC can't crack down on everybody, and Alan Brochstein's too busy. So there aren't a lot of people out there being watchdogs. I still try to be a watchdog. There's a lot of paid promotion. So really, to sum it up, that's what I'd watch out for. I've been, criticized by some companies because I've called out their excessive spending. You can go to my website. We charge public companies $4,000 a month, which sounds like a ton to me to do what we do. They get value, so I'm not trying to denigrate it. There are companies that pay $50,000, $75,000 a month to do all sorts of crazy things, blast emails about how this is the next Amazon, the next Netflix, yada, yada, yada. So I think people need to be very wary that there's a lot of stock promotion and a lot of hype out there. And so if you're going to throw darts, maybe you'll get lucky, but maybe you'll end up with some of those heavily promoted stocks that are vapor. And I'm into vaporizers maybe, but not vapor.
Alan, you mentioned the caution, and I love that part of it because people seem to be trying to dive in head first. For those listening who don't invest, haven't invested in the past, or just looking to get into the cannabis investment the first time, what's the safest way for someone to start out in all of this?
Yeah. So like edibles, start low and go slow. I've been saying that for a few years. Hey, look, I have model portfolios, and I think for a lot of people that can make sense to just join my service and follow that. But there's a cost to my service. I have not been very optimistic about the mutual funds, but isn't it nice to say that they're cannabis mutual funds now? And I'm more optimistic about one. It's called Horizons. But the problem for most of your investors is HMMJ in Canada, and there's some other symbols too. And it's 1.1 billion, and the cost of management, you're not paying that much. It's indirect anyway. But the problem would be that it's focused only on the Canadian industry, really, for the most part. So if that's where you want to invest, I think that's if you don't know much about investing and you want to get in, there's another one that trades in the United States called MJ. I don't recommend that one. It's very strange. It has those Canadian LPs, but then it has all these unrelated companies. So, there are, I'm not going to tell you the names, but it's kind of interesting right now that there are a few publicly traded. They're in Canada, but they're focusing on the United States. I'm watching these very closely. Because I think that's a great way for investors that don't want to be so hands-on to maybe find professionals that they trust and invest in the publicly traded stock. This is open to anybody. At the same time, if some of your listeners are high net worth individuals or accredited, which means they have $200,000 a year more of income or $1 million in assets, I think a really smart thing is to find there's increasingly some people like myself, but probably smarter than me, that are focused on the industry, and they actually will take your money and invest it in private companies, but also sometimes in discounted securities of public companies. And there's a few of those. I've mentioned them to my subscribers at 420 Investor that, I'm not going to recommend these people because I haven't seen all the fine paperwork, but I recommend that you take a look at it, is what I'd say, because these people seem very professional, and I'm watching what's happening. They're getting great deals, like the Gotham Green Fund. I already mentioned that one. So, I can't tell people what they should do without knowing them or without even knowing what these other investors are doing, but it's getting nice. So I think there's a lot of options for people if they want to be hands-on, traders, active, or if they just want to find some professional and hand to them. Now, what doesn't exist right now is, you call it Merrill Lynch or a stockbroker. They're not going to help you, unfortunately. That's tough right now.
We're talking with Alan Brochstein, the founding partner at New Cannabis Ventures, in addition to being a founder, analyst, and portfolio manager at 420 Investor. You can check out 420investor.com, newcannabisventures.com, linked in the description of the podcast below. Alan, just a couple more questions for you. I've already deleted a handful of questions to make sure I get in the ones that I want.
Sure.
You know what I find curious? I'd love your opinion on, with banking still being an issue for cannabis companies in the U.S. I actually know of a company last week who had their account shut down. It's an ancillary company, not hands on the product. Right. I think it's kind of crazy that I can buy stock in a cannabis company located in the U.S., but those companies can have trouble just having a bank account to operate their business, which could affect the stock. Isn't that kind of crazy to you, how that's lining up right now?
Oh, you set that one up for a softball. Yes, it's crazy. And what's really crazy is, you can have a utility company, a power company that takes money from cannabis companies, and they don't have a problem with the banking. They should, if you're going to be logical. The issue becomes, if you're a money launderer, that's what they're worried about. And so I get it. I don't want to criticize banks for covering their, I don't know what we're rated here, but they're posterior. I won't say the ASS word, but it's a CYA type of thing, and I get it. And some community banks, which have less to lose than like a Wells Fargo, they'll be more proactive in serving the industry, whereas you'll see the Bank of America's and the Wells Fargo's maybe not be so friendly to the banks. So this happens, Tim. It's very unfortunate. And the reality is it can lead to people dying, and it's just crazy.
I have to ask, Alan, because this is an entrepreneurial-based podcast, and I'm assuming that the people listening to this have a entrepreneurial spirit if they're not currently, living their life as an entrepreneur trying to start a business. But as someone who has started and run a number of ventures, obviously now with New Cannabis Ventures, which has venture in the title, and 420 Advisor in addition to other projects you've worked on, what advice do you give to other entrepreneurs or people who are trying to start businesses that you've learned from your experience?
So I think I'm a good poster child for this. Stick to what you're good at and figure out how to make it work in the industry. I get people reach out all the time, Tim, and they're like, yeah, I'm a lawyer and I have this great idea for a cannabis product. I'm like, that's just probably going to be really hard to pull off if you have no marketing experience or anything like that. I'm not trying to discourage people, but there are a lot of people that look more for the idea as opposed to taking themselves and looking for the right spot for themselves. And the cannabis industry has so many opportunities, in the ancillary space, obviously, that extend well beyond kind of those things that come to top of mind. I'm going to be a grower, a processor, or a seller of cannabis. So that would be my advice. Just figure out a way to make you work in the industry. That's the first thing. The second thing I would say is learn the industry. It's very nuanced, and have respect for the people who've been fighting the battle for years to get legalization. I see so many people come in this industry and they're smarter than these people in their mind or whatever. They have no respect for that. And if you're going to succeed in this industry, I always tell my subscribers at 420 Investor, look for companies that get it. They don't necessarily have to have a C-level executive that has been growing cannabis, but they need to, have those relationships. And without naming the name, there's a company, so many of these companies are financial. I mean, it's people that raise money and they go do stuff, and they don't have the operational experience, and they don't have the heart and soul that the cannabis industry exemplifies. And so I like to see when they hire a superstar grower, for instance, and he may not, or she may not have that title, but that the company gets it. So those are kind of the two things I would say: to have respect for the culture and have respect for what your own talents are.
Oh, I love that. I haven't heard of that before. Don't make the industry work for. Wait, what was I trying to say? Don't make the industry work for you. Work yourself into the industry, kind of a thing. Alan, last question before we get you out of here. What's on the horizon for you, New Cannabis Ventures, and 420 Investor? What's coming up in the next year or so for you?
Oh, geez. Tim, I have to wake up even earlier and earlier and earlier. I was up literally this morning at 3:40 local time. I usually get up at 4:20 local time, coincidence, but that's Central Time Zone, and I work long hours. So what's on the horizon for me? I have got to get some people working with me at New Cannabis Ventures. I have a great partner. He's like me, working all day on this stuff. I have no partners at 420 Investors. So I think what's on my own horizon, I have got to get some analytical help. We have some ideas at New Cannabis Ventures. They're going to be achieved through partnering or through building it ourselves. We're a virtual business. I think it's hard to manage people that you don't know virtually. My partner and I have known each other for a few years now, and even before we started New Cannabis Ventures. And we have a great relationship through this virtual process. But I think, and we have a few people working for us part-time that are obviously virtually managed. So we're going to have to figure that part out. But I think hopefully my subscribers at 420 Investor, they know I've been talking about this for a while. And hopefully our readers at New Cannabis Ventures that are always looking for more and more resources. We have a lot of resources, but it takes time and effort to manage those resources. Our resources are like, we have 5 indices, we have an IPO calendar, we have an events calendar. That doesn't take that much time. We have a revenue tracker so people can quickly look up and see who's actually earning a lot of revenue in the industry among publicly traded companies. We have a lot of ideas. I'm not going to tip my hand right now, but we are looking to roll out more resources at New Cannabis Ventures, more types of content. And then at 420 Investor, I'm going to try to not have to be the only person running the show. So that's what you can expect.
His name again, Alan Brochstein. He's the founding partner at New Cannabis Ventures. Additionally, founder, analyst, portfolio manager at 420 Investor. You can check out both of those websites in the description of the podcast below. Alan, you're a busy guy, man. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show. I can't wait to have you back already because like this has been unfolding, I feel like we could get back together in a couple of weeks and we'd have so much more to talk about. So we'll definitely have to get you back on the show. Okay, man?
For sure.
Thanks for doing it. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Tim.
That's going to wrap it up for us on the show this afternoon. Again, big thanks to our guest, Alan Brochstein. Feel free to check out his site in the description of the podcast below. Quick reminder before we get out of here, don't forget to follow us on social media at Stay Rooted across the board so you can stay up to date with what we're doing. We have a possible spin-off podcast that we're about to announce, and our TV platform continues to take off. So we are going to be sharing more on those social platforms with you. Hit up the site stayrooted.com. Follow us on YouTube as well. But as for this show, it is now over. My name's been Tim Stromble, thanking you for listening and reminding you one more time before we get out of here to work hard, be humble, and stay rooted. We'll see you next week. Take it easy, everybody.